Hi, and welcome back to the panel room. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight we are pulling out our 6-shooters to pop off at the aliens, the ghosts, and God only knows what else. We're here to talk about weird westerns. So before we go too far into the shootout down the street, let's see who all is sitting in the windows. Bebe, you're up first.
Bebe Bayliss. I write mysteries and sci-fi and Weird West as Bebe Bayliss, and some of that I co-write with Gini Koch.
Hang on. Paige. All right.
We need to
just restart.
Yeah,
just restart it, Bebe, and we'll be fine.
Okay. Bebe Bayliss. I write mysteries and sci-fi and Weird West and other delicious and stabby things, and often I co-write them with Gini Koch.
Paige?
I'm Paige Christie, and I write feminist westerns with dragons and contemporary fantasy, and I do a little bit of IP for Valdemar and whatever else strikes my fancy.
Marlena?
Hi, my name is Marlena Frank. I write young adult fantasy, horror. I've got a weird Western series coming up with werewolves and vampires.
Jenny?
Hi, I'm Gini Koch. I write the Alien Catherine Kitty Cat series for Bell Books. I also write under a variety of other pen names and in all lengths and genres. And particularly as A.E. Stanton, I like to write Weird West. And as Bebe said, I write a lot of it in print.
Misty?
I am Misty Massey. I'm the author of the Mad Kestrel series of pirate fantasy adventures. I am an editor for Lore Seekers Press. For Mocha Memoirs Press and for Falstaff Books. And I have a Weird West series, the Dead Man series, coming out from Falstaff, hopefully sometime this year.
And Jay?
Hi, I'm Jay Smith. I'm a podcaster, audio drama writer, and producer, and I've written a couple of books. One of my earliest projects in audio drama was a weird Western that predated Winona Earp, which is one of my favorite weird shows. And I've always been a big fan of the history of the Wild West, but I've only recently come around to some of the better aspects of Western and weird Western literature.
Looking at the notion of Westerns, now we see Western motifs used not only in classical periods set in the Old West. You know, we famously have seen them across science fiction, fantasy. A lot of the time we see it in fantasy worlds where it's a Western setting. So Weird West is a pretty wide genre. You know, and as we've already even dove into, it can be everything from the ghosts roaming through the Old West, vampires, werewolves. You know, there's probably a couple of infected prairie dogs out there somewhere that are, running around. We, of course, have aliens and cowboys. So we kind of see this all over the place. I mean, if we look at The Mandalorian is kind of its own wild Western setting. So, Bebe, what flavor of weird Western and do you really like to get into?
My favorite is the gadgetry of the weird gadgetry. So Wild Wild West and the late great Briscoe County Jr., which I wish was somewhere on. If anybody has a tip where I can stream that, I'd love to, because that one never gets old. So for me, it's all about the gadgets, because that just takes a really nice Western story, and I adore traditional Westerns, and then it just adds a little wah and makes it special. So that's my first love in weird.
Paige?
Wow, that's a tough one, because I've pretty much been in love with Westerns since I learned what one was. I would say, as far as Weird West goes, the thing that strikes me and makes it interesting is sort of that outlaw loner kind of vibe that you get from folks, and usually the landscape that they choose to set it in. Because when people think Western, they think Old West, specifically between the American Civil War and the early 1902, 1905, in that era. But the West, as a place, a physical place, exists and has always existed. And so when you take the vibe of the energy and the stories that have come out of that landscape and move them anywhere else, that's to me what makes it a Western.
Marlena?
I really love the unexpected when it comes to weird Westerns, whether that's gadgets, whether that's supernatural entities, whether that's outlaws around the corner. I just love, like, the West itself historically was such a dangerous location. And I think I just love the mixture of that with supernatural elements, because it even like raises the already very high stakes that you have in that kind of environment. It's just a lot of fun to dive into, and it's a lot of fun to write, and it's a lot of fun to just consume.
Jenny?
A lot. Well, I'm going to echo Bebe and Marlena, really. Wild Wild West was huge for me. And I do like the gadgets, but more, I really like the creatures, especially because in reality, the Old West was, especially as compared to the East was civilized, the Old West was barbaric. And yet, within that barbarism, you had a lot of things that can happen. Rampaging werewolf has an entirely different makeup if it's rampaging in a city versus rampaging out west where there's no one to run to for help. So I really like the supernatural aspects of it, like Marlena said, the unexpected of, well, I think it's going to be outlaws or renegade Indians or whatever, but in fact, it is a vampire. And I'm not equipped to handle that because I don't know any of this lore. That's the other thing. A lot of that wasn't around in that time frame. So I think it makes it really interesting and very exotic within something that is very romanticized, but is still very, very much a part, at least of culture, because it's not just American, Canadian. Canada and Australia also really have a strong Western heritage.
Misty?
Well, I was going to marry Artemis Gordon when I was a little girl. So, and yes, everybody else liked James West, but Artemis Gordon was my boyfriend. So, because smart is sexy. But even with that said, my real fondness for weird Westerns, I think, is the isolated nature of everything that everybody has to do. If you're going to do magic, you can't just depend on there being supplies handy and down in a magic shop. You're going to have to figure out different ways to make it function. You also, like Ginny was saying, you have to consider the specific lore of where you are. And I like that isolated, alien to me, essentially a city girl. I like that differentness, that strangeness about the world of the desert and the world of the outlaw, just being out away from everything and having to do what you can to make your magic or whatever you're using work. I like that sort of that weirdness. So.
Jay?
I like the universe of possibilities that the Old West provides any writer. When I first got into the stories, they were the audio dramas, the radio dramas of the 50s, which were largely male power fantasies and wish fulfillment. But I realized when there's quality fiction being written in a Western setting, it's about humans overcoming adversity, internal and external, and then in an environment that's familiar but just weird enough. And then when you add a layer of fantasy or horror or science fiction on top of that, it can be really entertaining, because it seems like the Western is a genre that strips away a lot of conventional conceits about people, where the characters are basic. They're familiar, and then readers or listeners or viewers can project themselves onto those characters and kind of go vicariously on the ride through the story, which I think it's common in a lot of genres, but I think it's particularly evident in Westerns, which are always written as parable, either as part of American history or culture, but open enough that those of us who like the genre see ourselves kind of doing a Westworld, but in our own imagination. So I think it's allowing it's accessible to readers, but it's also inclusive to readers.
And Tamsin, would you like to do an introduction?
Hey, sorry I'm late. I didn't have a link.
Oh,
I've been messaging everybody for about 30, 40 minutes going, can someone send that to me? And so finally I called Gail and she answered and sent it over.
sorry. I didn't see you ping me.
Yep, I messaged you on Facebook.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm reaching out to you and Jeannie. I'm like, anyway, I'm here now. Hi, everybody. I'm Tamsin Silver, and I'm an author with Falstaff Books. I write historical fantasy that revolves around Billy the Kid in the Lincoln County War.
So we're just starting to dive into a little bit about what aspects of, kind of weird Westerns do you like?
Oh, I like any weird Western that takes a different look at history. And I like when they come up with their own kind of world and magic system. And they kind of it's something new and fresh and different. I don't actually read as much as you might think I do a weird Western, because I spent most of my time reading historical books. But for me, I like that hero that is a little bit reluctant and who learns to be who they need to be throughout the story.
So let's take a little bit deeper dive. So if I am looking at or thinking about crafting my story, and I'm going to go set it in a Western setting, right? That doesn't necessarily mean Wild West, Old West. That could be, Aboriginal Australia. That could be some planet on an alien planet that's still that same aesthetic. So Paige, I'm going to start with you on this one, especially since you like to play with the dragons in yours. What are the pieces that are going to be critical for setting that up to be that weird Western setting, and how do you make it yours?
Well, wow. Okay. I think that there's always a component of family or found family in Westerns. There's usually something that someone is protecting. You're usually talking about, in my opinion, even when you're dealing with something like Firefly, where there are spaceships, a lot of the places they go have limited technology, limited settlement, limited resources. And so you're having to make do on your own. There's an independence you need to give your characters. There's an agency you need to give your characters. There's something that people need to defend. There's some level of honor, I think, that comes into whoever your protagonist is. They don't have to be perfect. They can be dark and slightly honorable. Some folks that have really done this well, Andre Norton did weird Westerns really well. One thing that very few people know is that the original Beastmaster, the books, is a weird Western. It is a Western set in space. That is not what translated to the screen later on. But that book was one of the first weird Westerns I ever read. And it was so driven on the character having a sense of place and family and searching for a place they belonged in this wilderness that was not their home. And so I think that that's a component for me that always shows up in Westerns. And in my case, then you add dragons, because why not? So yeah, that's where I come in. Family.
Marlena?
I think what's interesting to tackle with Westerns and kind of crafting that, especially weird Westerns, is historically you have to look at why people were out there. Look at your characters and figure out why did they go out there. Because it's, like I said, it's a dangerous place to go. But it also offered historically a lot of freedom for people. So you had a lot of queer people that went there because they weren't persecuted. You had a lot of women that went out there and they joined other women and did homesteading on their own because they were allowed to, things like wearing pants was frowned upon. So like looking at the level of freedom that you get from that environment and figuring out like reasons it's a great place for people to hide, for example, for bad guys and stuff. So it's also a really great way to hold up people, make some easy money. So I think getting reasons and purpose behind characters is a great way to build that.
Jenny?
Can you repeat the question? I got wrapped up in everybody's answers. I don't remember what the question was.
Well, yeah, how do you kind of take that notion of the weird Western and what the aesthetics that are important to you and then make it yours? What is it that really sets that Western aesthetic and makes it yours?
Well, for me, it's setting the story in the West or Westlight at location. So location is really important. I think because you can set a Western in a city. They did it with McLeod. But it's a lot harder. It's a harder sell. It's the Western morals against the Eastern morals. And I'm not as interested in that. I can do it, but I'm not as interested in it. I want to know where my setting is, what's my character's motivation? Who's my character? Who's my good guy? Who's my bad guy? Why are they doing it? And then the overlay of part of the why is usually due to some paranormal outside influence in what I'm writing. I have it where, you've ended up at three people who should be trying to kill each other or at a bar, and they are playing cards with death as embodied in a beautiful woman. And they manage to cheat and win, and they ride off together, even though walking in, they should have killed each other. So I like doing things like that. To me, that's a subversion of expectations. But again, for me, it's all that paranormal or science fiction or fantastical overlay that really matters. Because otherwise, I'm writing a straight Western, which I also do. If I don't have the overlay of that paranormal, it's just, and I particularly prefer the paranormal to science fiction on those. If I don't have that, it's not weird anymore. It's just Western, which I love, but it's not a weird Western.
Misty?
Well, for one thing, it's the sense of independence. I like when I'm working on a weird Western, when I'm working on my Dead Man series, for example, he's come back. It's about Doc Holliday. He's come back. He's been brought back to life 4 years after he died, and he doesn't really know why. And this is a man who lived on his own and was able to find his way through the West. And so suddenly he is back to where everything started. He's back to not knowing anything. And he hates that. And so it's that need for personal independence that really drives him, and that I think fits into the weird Western aesthetic, because it's so easy to fall into what a society requires of you. And out in the West, things were just not that quite cut and dried. And so being independent and being able to find your own way was absolutely vital. And that's what my character is trying to do. So that's what I work with when I'm working on weird Westerns, is making my characters, giving them an independence drive and making sure that they can find their own way no matter what.
Jay?
Someone once told me that Westerns aren't really about a time or a place, but a culture and a situation or experience, which is why there's so much literary overlap between Westerns, weird Westerns and fantasy settings and post-apocalyptic fiction, which I spent a lot of time writing. It's, for me, when I wrote a zombie survival fiction, there were a lot of direct parallels between that horror and science fiction and the Western genre, which is you are reduced to basic 19th century technologies. You have castes, you've got cartels, you've got different roles to play. And there's a lot of what everyone else is saying about the elements of Westerns are there in terms of some have a code of honor, some are violent desperados, there are military units that represent the cavalry. There are savages, quote unquote, across the land that have to be dealt with, and then there are the monsters. So you could almost say that The Walking Dead is its own kind of weird Western, because by the midpoint of that series, it was not about the monsters at all. It was about the societies that were coming up, which are directly parallel to what was being created out west. And when I write that, I keep in mind, like others have already said, everybody is out there for a reason. Everyone has an objective. It might just be as basic as survival. They weren't welcome where they were. They, like in Doc Holliday's case, he couldn't survive in the South with his condition. And just a quick side note, I love how Val Kilmer made that monster sexy. And we just cannot get away from that racist, misogynistic murderer that really lived. That is the weirdest fiction in the Western genre, to transform Doc Holliday into a real, sexy, likable human being. But I digress. When I write this stuff, it's everyone has an objective. And like the Old West, people's objectives clashed. And the story has meaning only when we're in the middle of that confrontation. I want the rights to the water. Well, I'm going to move upstream and I'm going to take it from you. What are you going to do about it because you can't sue me? That basic kind of stuff. Now, if you've got Count Dracula living upstream from you on top of the hill and he's controlling the water rights, suddenly it's a weird Western. So it's fun. I would say I had a lot more fun writing the very human elements of horror fiction that had Western tropes to it than writing straight Westerns, even though I've done some of that too.
Tamsin?
I'm really driven by history itself. So for me, it was about, I have a background in education. And so for me, I always love the idea that the books teach. And I just happened to be in the Western because I fell in love with the story of Billy the Kid. And learning everything that surrounded John Tunstall's murder and everything that ensued that we were never taught in school, that we didn't, maybe the people in New Mexico were, but in Michigan, no. And for me, I think that, but as far as what drew me to being invested in that Western was the fact that it was all the things I didn't know. It was all this wide open opportunities to build what I wanted and tell a story about a young man who people don't actually know well. I loved the idea that I got to introduce the real Billy the Kid to people, minus werewolves and witches. But it was very important to me. I spent 6 years doing research to get those as close as possible to who he really was. I made promises at his mama's grave that I'd write him right. You know what I mean? So for me, it is, I like writing in that Western world because of Billy, because of the story I felt of his that needed to be told. And I just wrapped it in Irish folklore because I'm a fantasy writer and I'm not a history writer. But I think one of the things that's really interesting, and everybody's mentioned all the things, like there's nothing new I'm going to say that I think is going to be amazing. But I think something that really blew me away is when I understood that Lincoln County at the time was the size of what is now South Carolina. It had one sheriff, 100 proof alcohol, lots of gunpowder. And a bunch of people who'd fought in the war, who had one side, and a bunch of people who were just trying to find, and I love what, I don't remember who said it now, family, trying to find family, because that's what Billy's doing. I mean, his mom died at 12. He got split from his brother to live with someone else. And then he went, he kept getting shoved around. He got put in jail. He escaped. And then he was on the run trying to find where he belonged forever. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the big things from Wild West is that found family, like you mentioned with Firefly. And so I really loved that portion of working on the story, was getting to know these people and understanding this time period and how that it relates to what was before and what comes after and what we see now. Because when I say the Santa Fe ring still exists here, it does.
Evie?
I think that traditional Westerns and traditional science fiction share an enormous amount of DNA. So sliding between the two and making it Weird West is actually a pretty lovely thing to do. both genres are predicated on the fact that there is always an other. It's a conceit where someone who is escaping something or is adventurous goes into an empty quadrant, whether it's land on Earth or a new planet. And of course, it's not empty at all. There are Martians living there. There are indigenous people living there. So it's a lot about colonialism, about pushing other people out. And therefore, it's about fear of the other. And I think that fear of the other is such a key, for me anyway, it's such a key component of what makes sci-fi great and what makes Westerns great, because the biggest enemy is either turning that lens inside and examining your own fear, or turning it outside and trying to figure out, are you attacking the monster or are you the monster? And then when you make it weird, you just add magic or dragons. And I say just because it's not that easy. But I think that stories can be sort of crafted in very much the same way, because they do share so many similarities right down at the foundational level.
So Marlena, I'm going to start with you on this one. When we think about some of our favorite examples, who's somebody, whether it's books, TV, movies, whatever it is, what's something that to you is kind of that quintessential example of weird Westerns?
Well, what really got me inspired to, because I came at it from probably a very different angle, is I consumed a lot of comic books and things like that when I was younger. And the Jonah Hex character from DC, who's always going up against aliens and supernatural creatures and everything in the world, that was very cool. That was a great introduction. But I think quintessential, when I think of weird Western, I think of like Stephen King's Dark Tower series. That one was very inspirational for me. So, yeah.
Jenny?
Wild Wild West all the way. That was, as it turns out, probably the most definitive show I ever watched, because there's a tremendous amount of Wild Wild West DNA in my brain that when I do a rewatch of the series, I'm like, oh, that's where I got that and that and that and that and that. And it crosses over into everything for me. It's the creation of steampunk. It's the creation of Weird West. I'm sure stuff like it existed before, but this was a hit series with, going into everybody's living rooms, and it's great, and it holds up amazingly well. There are a lot of older shows that really do not, and it does. You can watch it today, and it still feels fun and exciting and fresh, because it was a period piece in the day, so it has the period touches. It was steampunk in the day, and so it has all those touches. So I love that. That to me, those are my steampunk, Weird West, and even Western roots all go back into, and science fiction all go back into Wild Wild West.
Misty?
I will go with one of the earliest Western paranormal movies that I ever saw, and that was Clint Eastwood in High Plains Drifter, which is a movie. If you just watch it on the surface, it just seems like your standard Western guy rides into town and causes havoc, but it's actually not. There's so much more to it than that. He's a revenant ghost, and he is there to exert revenge on the people that wronged him. And when he's riding away at the end, just disappearing into the heat, into the heat squiggles, that rising up from the desert, it's just, it's so eerie and glorious. I didn't even really like Clint Eastwood movies until I started dating the man who became my husband. And he was like, just watch one with me. Just watch one with me. I swear you'll like it. And so that was, that was a standard Western from Clint Eastwood. And so I loved it, of course. And we moved on from there. And when I saw High Plains Drifter, I was just like, wowza, I couldn't believe it. So I'm going to go with High Plains Drifter.
Jay?
Misty took mine. I have to agree. It was, that's a perfect example. I have a very high bar for when you mash up genres. It's often done ineptly. It's Billy the Kid meets Dracula is kind of the thing I think of when I see Cowboys versus Aliens. it's kind of here's a cool idea that shouldn't work, but I know that authors have done it really well. So I go in with kind of reservations on it. But High Plains Drifter, I wish I remembered the interview that Clint Eastwood gave that explained High Plains Drifter 2 in concept, because the Wild West, there was no objective reality there. There was no, you couldn't go into Tombstone, which was just a hole in the ground, really, almost literally at the beginning, where two newspapers couldn't agree on the basic facts of what happened the day before. So you get a situation where no one knows what happened and they lived it. So you have High Plains Drifter, which I think he said, and I'm paraphrasing, it is a movie that would be the result of polling everyone who was there at the time and trying to make sense of it. And it takes on its own mythical, mystical quality that it's not like a Stuart Lake, this is exactly how it really happened, and Wyatt Earp was a white hat cowboy. Like, well, he wasn't even a cowboy, dude. He was a pretty weird dude. But then it's kind of taken on, there's a movie that came out a few years ago called Tombstone Rashomon, which framed the gunfight. I think it was, what is it? Alex Cox directed it. And it takes the Tombstone fight from different points of view, just like the original Rashomon film did. And it explains that kind of why the West is such fertile ground for weird fiction. It's because just being out there at that time, being whether you were a European immigrant or just an Easterner who lived in a city, just physically being in Nebraska or California or Arizona was a weird experience. You might as well have been in Narnia or in Middle Earth, because just the environment was so alien that he didn't say this, but somebody else said that applicable to the sound design in High Plains Drifter, the weird noises that show up in these westerns, especially spaghetti westerns, random bird cries, that there's no bird in the shot or anywhere near. It's all symbolic. And that's a result of people who lived toward the beginning of the last century, who remember being out there for the first time and being isolated from all of the regular sounds they heard. The sounds of the city, the sounds that are normally alarming, normally comforting. When you're in the middle of the wilderness and you hear those noises at night, your brain is creating ghosts. Your brain is creating all of these supernatural things around you, struggling desperately to find patterns. And so High Plains Drifter and its kin, the Man with No Name trilogy, all have that supernatural quality that goes beyond the white hat westerns of Cold War propaganda that I used to hate, and try to insert a bit of mysticism and spiritualism into the genre.
Tamsin?
I think the first thing that I fell in love with, Western-wise, believe it or not, was Lone Ranger. Because as a kid, I watched that and I just loved that idea of that show. And it wasn't a weird Western, but it was my first Western. And I would rush home to watch that show, and I loved it. But it was interesting because I didn't end up staying in watching Westerns as a kid. Like, I'm new to being involved in Western discussions. I got pulled in by writing this series. And, but I think the TV show that really did it for me, even though it's more sci-fi than fantasy, maybe not, would be Westworld. I know that's a much more recent piece, but I really I could not stop watching this show. Like, I was just binging it, and I was just fascinated at the choices that were made. It was like I didn't see the original. And so for me, when that came out, I think that was something that drew me in with the characters and the way it was, just the whole thing was built. And for me, I think that's really what really inspired me even more when I was working on the series. Other than that, maybe, I watched a lot of Firefly. I love that kind of thing, but I wasn't a big Western watcher of things or reader of things until recently. So when people are like, oh, what is the thing that you used to, read or whatever long ago that really, and I'm not that person. And so I'm probably the odd man out here. But for me, I think it is just that I fell in love with the entire story of the history. And so that pulled me in more than anything else that I could even think of at this time.
Bebe?
I grew up watching Westerns on TV because I grew up when I was very small. It was the golden age of the TV Western. But I read science fiction. I never watched science fiction on TV. So it was sort of words and music in terms of the two genre. But I was also fortunate enough to grow up in California, where the veil between real and weird is very, very thin. So like we'd go up to San Francisco to visit my dad's family, because I grew up in LA. And we were on the Sausalito ferry and we went past Alcatraz. And in the late 60s, a local native tribe took over Alcatraz, claimed it back as their own land. So you're on the ferry tootling up to Sausalito, and there are people dressed in gigantic headdresses having ceremonial dances and all of that in Alcatraz. And it was a normal thing. So my little kid brain kind of mushed all that stuff together in real life. Plus, San Francisco always felt it was very close to its Old West and its gold rush roots. Los Angeles had a history of just when I was a kid, it was still growing like crazy, just pushing out in every single direction. Plus, my parents didn't edit what I read, so the neighbor down the street started giving me analog when I was 5 years old, and that was it. So there's no particular point at which Weird West became a thing. It was sort of a fortunate confluence of what I watched, what I read, and what I encountered. But Briscoe County Jr.
Paige?
Well, I've been listening to all this, and I
who
keep
can't love Bruce Campbell? I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
Come on. I would say all of the above. Like I grew up watching Westerns on TV. My mother was a huge fan of like High Chaparral and The Rifleman and all of those. And so both my parents were Western junkies, and I watched everything. High Plains Drifter was chef's kiss. Mwah, love that one. But I posit that Westerns by definition are already slightly supernatural. 3 of my all-time favorite books are The Untamed, The Night Horseman, and The Seventh Man by Frederick Faust, writing as Max Brand. There is a supernatural element to those books. They're traditional Westerns. There's posses and robberies and shoot-'em-ups and angry landholders, and there's all the tropes. But the hero of that story, you're not sure if he's not in possession of some sort of otherworldly power. From the moment you meet him as a child, he's kind of like Heathcliff. There's something different about him. And everything he touches takes on a supernatural element. The horse he rides can run for hours at full speed. That's not physically possible. And yet the horse does. The horse becomes, it's a trio that's formed. It's the man and the horse and a wolf. And they are best friends. But it only holds as long as the man is in control. And so it's a traditional Western, but there's an underlying energy to it that I find in most Westerns, that things are a little different. Somebody is always a little bit better. There's always the gunslinger who's a little too good. There's is that possible? The card player who never loses. There's an energy in a Western that always to me has had a slightly supernatural element. You mentioned Los Angeles. One of my other favorite Westerns is The Lonesome Gods by Louis L'Amour, which is set around the founding of Los Angeles as a city, and as it's being removed from Spanish custody, and they're looking at statehood. And it's about a child whose father takes him out there, and he gets lost in the desert. before they reach Los Angeles, and the lonesome gods save his life. And who are the lonesome gods? Well, you have to read the book to find out. But there's always in Westerns, to me, an element that is other, an element that is beyond. And I think that's part of the reason I fell in love with them as a child.
And one of the things for me, when you look at any classic Western, is you've got the heroes. I mean, it's if you've got your hero, your protagonist in a Western, or your protagonist, because a lot of the time they are kind of a little bit of that group setting, even if it's a dynamic duo, such as the Lone Ranger, or things along these lines. What's different about your hero, your protagonist, that you're going to put in a weird Western? So, Jenny?
I think one of the keys that a real protagonist has to have in a weird Western is the open-mindedness to accept that something weird is going on that he or she has to solve, versus, the nope, that's not possible. It's a man in a mask, which is Scooby-Doo, but Scooby-Doo's usually, accurate. But if you've got a hero, be it your lone cowboy, your sheriff, your rancher, the saloon hall madam, whatever, the bartender, the piano player, whoever you want to pick, your gambler, they have to be willing and able to see that there's something other going on, and either roll with it and accept it, or realize that other needs to be stopped. Because if they don't, how does the reader know what's going on? Then it becomes your protagonist is dense, or isn't paying attention, or is refusing to see things, and you can work with that, but it doesn't sound like the right thing. If you've got one man or one woman saying this town is covered in ghosts, and everyone else going, yeah, that's conflict right there. If everyone else in town is going, this place is covered in ghosts, and your protagonist is like, no, it's not. That's a comedy. It's not necessarily going to be, it's going to be differently compelling. So I really think your protagonist needs to be open enough, or aware enough, or willing enough to say, that's out of the ordinary, and I'm going to not argue that it's out of the ordinary. I'm going to accept it, and I'm going to try to figure out what to do and to fix it.
Misty?
One of the things that I really like about Westerns, and especially, working on weird Westerns, is that everybody's got a place. The West, early Westerns, early TV and movie Westerns notwithstanding, because there was a whole lot of white people going on in those days. But really, everybody's got a stake in Western stories. Native Americans, of course. Some white people. But then Asian people who came over from the other direction, from Asia to try to find a better life in the West. Black people who were newly released from slavery, who were looking to make their own way in the world. Hispanic people who came up from Mexico looking for a better life. Everybody's got a stake in Westerns, and so because of that, you can draw. You've got so many worlds that you can draw from. Even if you're not writing a Western that's taking place in a completely imaginary world, if you're writing it in the real world, you've got lore from so many cultures that you can draw from and make the story really brilliant and different and interesting. And so that's something that I've always found wonderful. I was fortunate to help edit a book, Lawless Lands, Tales of the Weird Frontier, from Falstaff Books a few years ago. And one of the things we put in our requirements was that we wanted stories that were not just white cowboys running around. And so we got some amazing stories about characters that were not your standard white male protagonist, and it was wonderful. So,
Jay?
Touching back on something that Tamsin said earlier, a lot of this is about the history. What I think makes the Western genre so compatible with other speculative fiction genres is that all of the archetypes and characters are suitable for weird situations. These people are out in the frontier because they couldn't survive in normal society, whatever that meant to them, or under normal civilized circumstances. So I've often talked about monsters as metaphor, in that it's very easy to compare a typical monster or alien to a real life counterpart in the West. So there's always a lycanthrope out there, which is a metaphor for some form of uncontrollable violence and savagery. There are vampires, literal and figurative, out in the West. And it's very easy for those protagonists and antagonists to take roles in that culture as though this can't possibly be any weirder than me seeing my first tornado in Kansas. It's not, seeing a horizon without any hills on it for miles. It's so unusual already that these people are prepared to survive and interact with people who have thrown off the veil of polite society, that they're not going to directly interact with you as a gentleman. And the standards are going to be, in fact, most Westerns toward the second half of the larger 20th century boom of the genre talked about the Peckinpah style of transitioning to civilization, where all of these weird, wild misfits came out west to civilize it their way, only to have civilization catch up with them and force them to be civilized the way they didn't want to in the first place. So what's great about it is, if you know the history and you're not jaded or corrupted by what Misty and Gini were talking about, the whitewashing of the genre with, like I said, the male power fantasy. There's always a white male hero to save the day, and there's a supporting cast of women to love him and minorities to respect him. There's such a diverse community of people out there that they've already seen the weirdest kind of shit you can throw at them. So alien, whatever. Am I still getting paid for the night, boss? That's the kind of attitude that most of these characters have. So I love that. That's the aspect of it that I respect most and that I look for in fiction.
Tamsin?
Repeat the question for me so I make sure I stay on and don't repeat someone.
Well, just sort of looking at what makes that hero, that protagonist in a weird Western different.
Different from just Western itself?
Different. Your choice on how you want to take different.
Unique. Make unique. I mean, obviously, for me, when I'm doing it, because I'm so focused on the history, for me, what makes it unique is whatever fantasy and world I've built around it. And one of the things I really want to jump on some of the things everybody said, though. I love the fact that we're talking about not whitewashing, and how I made that was really hard. I had to make sure, because there are so many men named John in this time period for me, and there's so many white men that I was working to pull in women of color and women in general, because there weren't any. So for me, I think it's a diverse cast of a united group of people. Think of like an ensemble cast, even though for me, I think it's not just, Billy's my lead and Brewer's behind that, but it's the regulators. It's what they stand for. It's the fact that they are there to fix and help people. It's the fact that I wanted that we brought in everyone and made it this whole kind of team effort, because back in the day, that's what you had. A lot of people moved out west and family members died, or they came out by themselves, especially like we mentioned earlier, women came out, and they had to try and figure everything out there on their own. And so a lot of times these people, and one of the things that it makes it for me is watching them bond together against some sort of evil that is hurting other people. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I love about those kind of things is, like Tombstone, the movie, like, sure, yeah, Doc Holliday now is seen as a sexy dude, and these guys are seen as doing the right thing. But that's what I mean. That movie, that feel of, all right, fine, we're gonna come together. Everybody's gonna, and that's something I love. That's a trope that I love, and that means a lot to me, and that you'll see it in throughout stuff I write, specifically in the Billy the Kid and my Weird Westerns. Does that answer the question?
Give or take.
Give or take. Thanks. I'm out. No,
that's what you get for. Oh, you were late.
I was, yes, all my fault, obviously.
BB.
Again, because sci-fi and westerns share so much DNA, I think for a protagonist to be properly weird, they need to have something that transcends the weirdness that is just the West. I think of the movie Little Big Man, right? Dustin Hoffman, early 70s. He plays a white guy who's, I think he's first a soldier, and then he's a mule driver, and then he marries into a Native American tribe and spends a lot of time with a shaman, and then comes back out the other side to go do something else. And he falls into a lot of situations where he's like, yeah, all right, seems logical. So his ability to, like so many people who I think thrived in the Old West, the ability to just roll was kind of right there in their character. So I think for a protagonist to stand out in a Weird West, they have to have something that even transcends Native American rituals and how close they were to nature and magic. I think it really needs to go sort of extra. So be telepathic, be magical, be something that isn't already there in the landscape or in especially around what's happening in the indigenous world.
Paige?
I'm thinking about the series that I just finished a while back, which is the Western with Dragons, and the characters in that. They basically, what I did is I took the Dragon Slayer trope and I dropped it in an Old West setting. So how do I make those characters? How do I make those characters fit in both situations? Well, I've got cowboy knights. You know, they don't have 6-shooters. They got swords. So it's playing with those tropes, giving the feel of place, of travel, of landscape, of dust, of heat, of all of those things, of, you know, frontier towns with boardwalk porches and the whole thing. And then putting in a character that in that setting, because he has a sword that's not a cavalry sword, it's a sword, you know, it's a broadsword or a hand and a half bastard sword or whatever the fuck it is, that doesn't quite fit in that setting, that puts that spin on it. When you take that place that you expect and you add in basically a knight, a series of knights, a whole pile of them running around doing caravan things and leading wagon trains. It's a bit different. It's not what people expect. So for me, it was taking those two situations and melding them. So I've got a character that you expect in a setting you don't expect, or a setting you expect with a character you don't expect, depending on how you look at it.
Marlena?
With how dangerous, you know, the Old West and especially Weird West is, I like a protagonist who is very empathetic. I think it contrasts very well with the dangers of your villains, the dangers of your landscape. And I think, you know, they're the ones that are like, who's going to risk their life to save the little guy out there who's about to get trampled or killed or something? You have to have strong empathy and be very brave to do that, even if you have a lot of, like, you know, personal issues. Like I've got in my series a werewolf who's doing that. So he's got his own issues, but he's going to put his neck on the line to help people. So I think, and that's one of the things I really love in Westerns, is that high empathy level that you have where they're willing to help, even at, you know, the risk of their own lives.
You know, my list of questions is much longer, but since we're kind of running out of time, I'm going to throw and let each of y'all kind of grab what's the one thing that you think we haven't talked about yet. I mean, you know, there's kind of the other side of this about, you know, what makes our antagonists and our villains and stuff different in the West. Yeah, they're the setting. There's a whole lot of things we can dive into. But Misty, what's something we haven't talked about yet that you think is important to talk about with Weird Westerns?
I would love to share some of the books that I've read that I think are amazing examples, if that's okay. I don't have to go.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I want to say Silver on the Road by Laura Ann Gilman, and The Last Stand of Mary Goodcrow by Rachel Aaron are both amazing examples of fantasy, weird Western with female protagonists. And these are they're not sugar-coated at all. These women go through some hell to get to their goals, and they're amazing. So Silver on the Road and Last Stand of Mary Goodcrow. And then there's an old one from back in the day, if you want to go really super weird, The Last Stand of the DNA Cowboys by Mick Farren. I think it was written in the 70s, and it's that whole 70s weird science fiction vibe going on. Very, what drugs was this guy on when he wrote it? But it's the Minstrel Boy, Reeve, and Billy Oblivion are the three DNA Cowboys, and they're having to ride through an apocalyptic West to try to keep a barbarian horde that's rampaging through from ruining what's left of the world that they have to live in. And but it's really weird, and like I said, it's got that 70s weird, which is completely different from just weird. There's weird, and then there's 70s weird. It goes a whole different direction. So those are some of the books that I think people, if they're looking to read some really good weird Western, I can definitely recommend those three.
Disco era weird Westerns.
Yeah.
Jay, how about for you? What's something we haven't talked about you want to dive into?
I think as I'm hearing writers talk about the craft and what makes the genres meld together, I'm thinking about my friends who just can't get into weird Westerns because they're so wrapped around the axle about historical accuracy. And I try to invite them to take off their historian cap and just enjoy. One of the biggest challenges I had, I'm a big fan of Winona Earp, and I'm friends with people who are creating conventions to bring these actors together because there's such a fan following. But I had somebody, a roommate of mine back in the day, try to watch this because he's as big a fan of Tombstone history as I am. And he was just unable to separate, well, that's not historically accurate. Wyatt Earp didn't have any kids, and that Doc Holliday's too handsome. And we got to an episode where they introduced Big Nose Kate, and she's a woman of color, and his mind melted. It was just so. I planned that evening with popcorn just to watch his head cave in as he watched these two characters. I said, dude, you were okay with vampires, you were okay with demons, you were okay with everything else, but Black Big Nose Kate was crossing the line for you. And that's illustrative of a lot of people who subscribe to like the true West ideal of the West. They love to get that magazine and argue with each other online about the historical accuracy. It's fun. So one thing a lot of people who get into the genre and complain about it don't get. It's telling a story in just a different weird way. And I caution other writers who get into the genre of being too historically accurate, because then you're drawing in those critics who are going to start nitpicking. Once you establish that it's true from a certain point of view, that's enough. And then you can add all of the other stuff and just ride the waves. It's all cool. But I have yet to convince some of my closest friends that Winona Earp is as good as I know it is.
Tamsin, how about for you? What have we not hit on?
You're on mute.
And you're on mute.
Sorry, I muted myself because my roommate came home and I thought my dog was going to bark, and then someone called and now I'm upright instead of whatever.
I was going to say you were already putting us through the portal of the spinning image anyway.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I was going to talk about, whether or not you're doing historically accurate and why it's not or is important, but we've just talked about that. So I guess what I'd like to say is one of the things that I think that is interesting to talk about is how you choose your protagonist and your antagonist. If you're doing something historical based on your good guy, how are you choosing that antagonist? So, because is it historically based? Is it fantasy based? And why did you choose the bad person you chose to be that antagonist for your main character? Because I feel like understanding that and how they're going to clash and why they clash and how that relates to your Western setting is exceedingly important and how your story flows. And for me, I went ahead because Billy is Irish. I chose Irish folklore, and I chose a random person from folklore whose name is horrible to try and say. And it's because I love the idea that she created both monsters and heroes. And if I don't even know if I'll say it. It's Gaelic. It's horrible. It's Skaha. It's horrible, right?
Your narrator thanks you.
Right. And someone always is like, someone will be like, how do I say this? I'm like, I don't honestly care. I will tell you how it's said at least once when you're reading it. And after that, you can do what you want. But I really, when I was thinking about that story, it was something that really mattered to me was, well, who's the bad guy and why? Because obviously there's all the Lincoln County War is real, and we could have just gone with that. But I love fantasy, and I love to bring fantasy into that history. And so for me, I think that one of the things I love talking about is, okay, so who is your antagonist? Why are they important? Where did they come from? How does that matter to you? How does that work itself out? How does that make things change depending on who your protagonist, who your antagonist is? If you change that antagonist, it's going to change your ending and how that works. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't talk about. They only are looking at, here's my protagonist. But that antagonist, I think, is exceedingly important. And it's something that I've always wanted to sit and chat with people about with concern to writing Western.
Evie?
I want to find more stories that bring in non-white, non-settler voices. I'm thinking, for example, of Underground Railroad by Colin Whitehead. Did I get that name right? Apologies if I did not. Which is about an underground railroad where slaves escape by an actual railroad that's under the ground. And it's an amazing, it sounds ridiculous when you say it because it's so obvious, but it's an amazing piece of fiction. And I'd love to see more Western stories told by people who have different experiences with the genre, more by women. I live in Canada now, and there's a lot of Indigenous original programming that's examining their history, their lore, depending on what nation they come from. I think it's a really big tent that can get a lot bigger. So that's what I'd like to see more of in Weird. I also love that Weird-ish is bleeding out. Now you get things like Bridgerton, which is what, Weird Regency. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth using the word weird, and try to say that 3 times fast.
Paige?
Well, the thing that we were talking about, I think Misty started this off talking about books that come from a different point of view. The one that leaps to mind for me is Nicole Given Kurtz, The Sisters of the Wild Sage, which is Black women in the West. And they are barmaids and mystics and gunslingers and heroes. And it's fabulous. So I love that one. I want to see more of that. And then there's a series of books, there's a series of novellas by a British author called The Nunslinger. And she is a gunslinging nun. It's just like what it sounds. And then there's places where the Western vibe ends up somewhere completely different, like The Dark Valley, which is a German Western that came out about 5 years ago. And it's all in German, and it's set in Germany, but it's a Western. It's bizarre. And so there are different ways these voices are coming through. I want to see more Westerns from a Native American point of view as well. I think the only one that comes close that I know of, it's an older book. I mean, I'm way off on this. I'm sure there are dozens, but one that leaps to mind is a book called Geronimo, and it's from Geronimo's point of view. But it talks about the mystical things that he does to try to keep his people safe. Only partly historically based and partly fantasy. I'm sure there are lots of Native American writers out there that are doing this that I don't know about, sadly, and I should. But I would love to see more works like those that take this this historical energy and give it to us from a perspective that we're not used to.
Marlena?
Well, I think there's a lot of aspects. There's, tall tales that you come across. Going back to what Paige said earlier about how the West really did have supernatural elements to it. You really get to those and those kind of, really good horseback riders, really good card sharks, things like that. And when you do research on this stuff, those kind of stories are just everywhere. You can't go several pages without seeing, oh, there was this story and there was that one. There's disappearing railroads and disappearing trains and stuff. And there's just so much that you can just peel apart and find interesting topics to go down. But also some interesting history that we've all probably researched along the way. There's maps you can pull up from the 1890s. You can see exactly what path the trains would take, and be able to calculate how many days it would take to go from one city to the next. It's crazy that kind of information is there for us to be able to pull up and just dive into. But I think there's always going to be more that we're going to unearth as we do that kind of research, and it's always going to be inspiring to our writing. And I think that's just a lot of fun, just to trade information we found when we dig up that kind of stuff.
Jenny?
Well, I'm one of those people, Jay, who I hate historical inaccuracies. They almost always pull me out. But give me the paranormal reason how that happened, and I'm all in. Okay? Don't put Jesse James in Oregon unless he rode through a portal. I can buy it then. Okay? Also, don't make him, looking for a girl because he had a girl back home. Right. There's just certain things that I can't take. But if you give me the good reason to believe it, just continue to suspend my disbelief, I'll take it. And I would guess your friend's problem is that Winona Earp is not saying this is an alternate universe. And if it says this is an alternate universe where Wyatt and Josie had a kid, then okay, right, I'm all in. But if it isn't, I'm with your friend there going, I can't take that. Though Big Nose Kate as a Black woman, fine. Though there's photographic evidence of what she looked like. Hideous. But she's there. I'm also, the first thing I ever wrote were novels set in the Old West. So I became an Old West expert, which is part of why it bothers me, because I did the research. And it's like Marlena saying, do the research. You can come up with a great answer and a great story if you just do the littlest bit of research. And to wrap around to what I think Bebe was saying is, and please, you can research the Native American tribes. It's not hard. Okay. There's plenty of information out there, and I do that and did that. So it bugs me when anybody writing in modern day has not taken one bit of effort to figure out what the Apaches call God, as opposed to what a Navajo calls God. Right? I mean, there's just basic language differentials. It's not all that difficult. It's really not hidden. And so just a little bit, put some verite in there. Give me a little bit, enough of real that I can believe where you take me weird. If you give me a Western setting that I know never happened, and I'm supposed to believe it's real, I can't do it. One of the greatest Weird Wests, I'm pretty sure this is the right title, is Purgatory, starring Eric Roberts. And there's a band of very bad people that ride into a town while they're escaping, and it is not the town they think it is. And it is fabulous because your suspension of disbelief just rides right along with them. So really good. So I want more purgatory and less, hey, I just threw this together because it sounded cool without doing any research. For me, if you're going anywhere in the past, do the modicum, do the meets minimum on the research before you just decide you're going to toss it in there, because there are those of us who want to burn it to the ground, and we go with you if you just gave us that little bit of, oh, it's an alternate universe. Oh, they walk through the portal. I'll take it. I can ride all the way through.
Well, before this posse rides into the sunset, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, latest releases. And because it's Weird West, I'm going to go backwards. So, Tamsin.
All right. You can find me at tamsinsilver.com. You can also find me on Facebook under Tamsin Silver. And if you want to dive into all the research and all the information I like to post for Billy the Kid, you can find Billy the Kid Rides Again. Look that up under Facebook and you can find it there.
Jay?
Everything that I have is at jsmithaudio.com. That includes the post-apocalyptic Western HG world. And if you like that stuff, you can buy my books.
Misty?
You can find me at mistymassey.com. You can find me on most of the social medias. I'm still on the site formerly known as Twitter, although I don't go there very often, but I'm very much on Blue Sky and Facebook and TikTok. So you can find me there. And if you just want to hear me do something that's completely not related to Westerns, I'm a cast member of the Authors and Dragons Actual Play D&D podcast. So come listen to me over there.
Jenny?
GiniKoch.com. I'm all over Facebook. If you want to sign up for my free newsletter, hook me up. You can do that from my main Hairspray and Rock and Roll. I'm also on X Twitter. I'm there because all the authors and readers that I know we're in our safe little bubble, ignoring everybody else. So come on over. We're still there. I'm also on Blue Sky and Pinterest. And my upcoming release that very much relates to this panel is the first in my novel series set in the Old West, Natural Born Outlaws, Legend of Belladonna, Book 1, and that comes out in June from Ginger Blue Publishing. I can speak.
Paige?
Oh, you caught me driving again. I have to get home. I'm Paige L. Christie everywhere. Make sure you throw the L in or you won't get me. I'm mostly on Facebook and Instagram. I abandoned the ex-Twitter in a huff. My next live appearance will be Con Carolinas 2024 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Come see me.
Marlena?
You can find all my books on my website at marlenafrank.com. You can hop onto my newsletter there to keep up with everything that I'm working on. Regarding this panel, you can pick up Night Feeders, which is the prequel to my Colton Fenn book, which is going to be coming out in September of this year. Follows a werewolf detective and helping supernatural creatures in the Old West.
And BB?
BBBayliss.com, most of the socials. Upcoming that's relevant to this is Gini Koch and I co-wrote a story about a paranormal detective in the Old West, and that's coming out in the Familiars anthology by Zombie Needs Brains.
Have Voodoo Will Travel is the title.
Have Voodoo Will Travel is our title.
And I'm Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingpros.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we'll see all you guys again soon. Off to ride in the sunset.